Thank you, Mr. Nemeth. Ladies and gentlemen, just to remind you all that we are live streaming today, so keep the background noise to a minimum. Thank you very much. My name is David Oldroyd-Bolt. It's my great pleasure to be the Master of Ceremonies for today's proceedings. I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker of the day, Mr. Lewis Libby. Mr. Libby was, as mentioned, Chief of Staff to Dick Cheney when he was Vice President. He was also the first American official into Budapest after the fall of the Berlin Wall and took the lead at the DoD on sweeping through Central Europe with Dick Cheney to make sure that all of the people from the former oppressed communist countries could engage with the West economically and on security. Our panel responding to Mr. Libby's remarks will be Mr. Attila Demko, the head of the Center for Geopolitics at the Mateusz Kowainas Collegium, Marek Matraszek, the chairman of the CEC Group, who was the first Western communications agency to set up after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Professor Hideshi Tokuchi, the first ever Vice Minister of Defense for International Affairs in Japan, and now at the Research Institute for Peace and Security since 2021 in Tokyo. We have Michael Anton, Senior Fellow at Claremont and Lecturer in Politics and Research Fellow at Hillsdale College. Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who from 2013 to 15 served for 2 years and succeeded in turning back the tide of people smugglers from Indonesia to Australia, an example that Western Europe is struggling to emulate. And finally, David Dusenbury, the Senior Fellow at the Danube Institute, visiting professor at Eötvös Loránd University of Budapest, and a historian of ideas at many institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Lewis Libby and our first panel.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to thank the organizers for putting together a session on these important topics. I'm particularly grateful that there is such a distinguished and expert group here to challenge our ideas on these things. And I want to say a special word of thanks to Jim Carafano, who said that I don't have to limit myself to saying appropriate things. I seldom get that sort of leeway. It's an oddity of conference keynotes that I'm asked to give my opinions before the experts in this room can educate me over the next 2 days. So I'm hoping that you will credit my youthful remarks from September 21st and replace them with the smarter things I would have said after this conference is over. It's a particular pleasure to be here in a thriving Budapest. As mentioned, I first came here in 1990, and Budapest was a study in contrasts in those days. The streets were somewhat drab, and the people were vibrant. They were excited about shaking off the Kremlin's hold, and also about the possibilities of being part of the free world. I was then in the Defense Department, as mentioned, and we believed that Central European states should have the right to select their own future and to share in the benefits and responsibilities of being part of the free world. Those 1990 sessions carried extra meaning for me because my first personal memory was of tanks rolling into Budapest in 1956. Even as a child, one could see that a courageous, freedom-loving people were being oppressed, and to think about how prolonged their oppression would be. Later, I learned to add an element of American shame to Hungary's grief. We had encouraged rebellion, but not responded to aid it. President Eisenhower lamented that Hungary was as inaccessible to us as Tibet, surrounded by Warsaw Pact countries and on the opposite side of neutral Austria. Budapest's tragedy was also, of course, Central Europe's. The word went out that the Kremlin could do as it wished in Central Europe, and it did. Within weeks of crushing Budapest, Soviet Secretary General Khrushchev told NATO ambassadors, "We will bury you." Then Khrushchev announced plans to eject American and Allied forces from West Berlin. To underscore his resolve, Khrushchev threatened nuclear war. Recent Soviet technological breakthroughs had boosted Western fears. Shortly before his Berlin announcement, the Soviets had launched the world's first ICBM, put the world's first satellite in space, and put the first man in space. Americans were years behind in these capabilities. But then President Eisenhower didn't buckle to the threat of war. The democracies had treaty rights in West Berlin, and Ike saw standing firm as the best way to avoid war. Incoming President Kennedy rebuffed the Kremlin's nuclear threats too. He had campaigned on the dangers of ignoring rising threats, and he built up our forces. However, he stumbled badly when he backed the Bay of Pigs invasion, but failed to provide air support. On a private walk soon after, Ike warned Kennedy that the Bay of Pigs disaster, quote, will embolden the Soviets to do something that they would not otherwise do. When the Kremlin sees weakness, Ike said, this is when they press the hardest. As John O'Sullivan's great work shows, Reagan and Thatcher's controversial policies to revive Western strength and resolve set the stage for the Cold War. Brave Hungarians first parted the Iron Curtain, and soon the Soviets voted overwhelmingly for independence from each other. American and European leaders alike applauded both the rebirth of freedom and Europe's new geostrategic realities. Since at least the middle of the 18th century, the Russian threat had periodically roiled European leaders. If, in an uncertain future, a revanchist Russia reappeared, new realities pushed that threat eastward and lessened resources within the Kremlin's grasp. However, one cloud loomed. To rid the Ukraine of Soviet nuclear weapons, in 1994, the US and Russia reaffirmed Ukrainian territory and sovereignty. At that time, I credited President Clinton for signing the accord in Budapest. Here, I thought, lay a subtle symbol of Western resolve. America would not abandon Kyiv, as it had abandoned Budapest. Putin had no such qualms. Having launched cyber attacks in the Baltics and invaded Georgia, in 2014, he drove tanks over the Budapest Agreement. The West protested and levied sanctions, but the costs Putin incurred did not approach how highly he valued his gains. From his new Crimean dacha, Putin saw this lesson reaffirmed as Chinese President Xi seized South China Sea atolls, broke promises not to arm them, defied international rulings, and declared these crucial international waters as a vast inland Chinese sea, the full import of which has yet to unfold. In defiance of international obligations, Xi's Chinese Communist Party choked off Hong Kong and stomped on Uyghurs. Chinese forces attacked along the Indian border and harassed ships in Japanese waters. The CCP stole Western technology, fostered anti-competitive assaults on Western industries, and then exploited its illicit gains and leverage over the West. In 2020, with COVID coursing through its cities, the CCP knowingly let the danger spread to other countries and covered up its actions, all in violation of international obligations. In the world abroad, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, died that could have been saved. It was not just a megapower China which flouted the world without commensurate costs. Syrian chemical assaults and Iranian attacks along the Persian Gulf, for example, bore them rewards greater than the response. In all of these cases, experts presented arguments for Western restraint. But here is a truth for the ages. When their gains regularly outweigh any costs, aggressors notice. The costs, if any, pass, while the greater gains endure. They learn that they can safely return for another bite. In the interim, neighboring states can see how the world trends. When the Russian invasion failed to topple Ukraine outright, many opined that Putin must regret starting the war. As body bags flowed back to Russia, many judged that Putin could not sustain the fight. Perhaps. But in Putin's eyes, Russian endurance won World War II. What, he might think, is Ukraine's war compared to that? Putin's view, recovering Ukraine is critical to Russia's reach. Now and in the future, he hopes to take more. For Putin may well doubt how serious the West is about Ukraine. Before the war, President Biden shrugged at Putin grabbing just another part of Ukraine. Perhaps that meant an area like where Russia is now. As the Russians advanced, Biden offered Zelensky a quick ride out, famously. In other words, a combative and popular Zelensky, not a determined Biden, kept the fight alive. Even today, Biden's mantra that America will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes falls far short of whatever it takes, whenever needed, for victory. In the mid-1960s, for example, the Kremlin sent North Vietnam several hundred fighter aircraft, 2,000 tanks, 17,000 long-range artillery pieces, and several thousand Russian officers, pilots, and trainers. The limits on current aid to Ukraine hearten Putin and Xi. So too do Western doubts about Ukraine's prospect, as referred to previously. Such pessimism merits scrutiny. Perhaps next year the Danube Institute could invite Count Wenzel von Konitz and Hungarian nobles of Maria Theresa's day to opine on whether manpower ensures success or early losses guarantee failure. Europeans don't always credit Americans with humility. But let me note that America's own War of Independence stalled badly in its early years, despite having a superpower of that era arming and funding us. Had America settled halfway into that war, New York, Philadelphia, the important port of Newport in Rhode Island, the Jersey coast, and most of the South would be British. It took time for our forces to learn how to fight, for our stubborn resistance to tell, and most critically, for our allies to believe we could win and throw real weight behind our efforts. If Putin persists, the question arises, how important to us are the stakes in Ukraine? In my 1990 meetings, Central Europeans sounded a common refrain. Sooner or later, the Russian periphery, and through it, European security, would once more be at risk. Post-Cold War American administrations saw things less clearly, betting mistakenly on a peaceful mellowing of Russia and the CCP. In a very different context, Hungarian poet Joseph Attila, apologies for pronunciation, wrote, "The sad old myths must die. The child sees now how foolish is his yearning." Over the last several years, there has been a sea change in American attitude towards Putin, the CCP, and their no limits partnership. Yes, there are some taking loud and contrary views on these and other issues, but it would be unwise to underestimate that broader bipartisan recognition that when Putin and Xi praise Stalin and Mao and restoring their once great civilization, what they're actually saying is they mean to restore a past where glory entailed subjugating others. They hope that the Western failure in Ukraine will begin to unravel the Atlantic European security order. So long as Putin or his like runs the Kremlin, Ukraine will be their first, but I fear not their last target. Only a just peace that leaves a strong Ukraine and conditions that deter future assaults will render peace secure. By contrast, the more that Ukraine is diminished in the current war, the more dangerous and demanding the post-war European security order will be. Perceptions of Western weakness in Europe will echo through Asia as well. The failing West is a major CCP theme. Russian success in Ukraine bolsters Xi's case. The CCP preaches Asia for Asians. If Ukraine is ground down, the CCP will whisper all along its periphery, the West sent too little, too late, to a democracy fighting for its life in the heart of Europe. What do you think the West will do for you, small and remote Asian lands? Biden protests that America will defend every inch of NATO territory. If Ukraine is ground down, the CCP will whisper to weak Asian states, "Are you in NATO?" If CCP leaders hesitate over Taiwan, Xi will whisper, "Did you not see the West failed Ukraine?" This is why key Asian states, including South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and Japan, endorse supporting Ukraine. Japanese Prime Minister Kishida rightly admonishes that security in Europe is crucial for security in Asia. Ukraine, he warns, may be the East Asia of tomorrow. For Europe and Asia, Eisenhower's warning about weakness remains relevant today. If they choose, the democratic nations have practical ways to meet today's challenges. Ukraine is not anymore as inaccessible as Tibet. We and our allies cannot claim ignorance of the potential costs of failure. Ours are alliances of sovereign states. That is their strength and their enduring challenge. Within alliance frameworks, sovereign states are free to engage deeply on a challenge or to hold back. That is their right. In the Cold War, America went one way, de Gaulle branched off another, Willy Brandt took a third. In the end, all made their contributions because all three were clear where the danger lay, believed in freedom and NATO, and worked actively for a Europe whole and free. Free riding and dissension are sovereign rights, but they bear costs that may in the long term undermine all of our interests. That is a challenge that my country, as well as others, must face. Budapest is a proper place to recall the legacy of courage gifted us by the courageous Central Europeans in 1956 and 1968. As we peer into the future, we should ask, how would they judge the democracy's responses in Ukraine? We should ask how, decades from now, history will judge us as we face the threats and opportunities of tomorrow. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to learning more from you all over the next 2 days.
Thank you, Mr. Libby, for those insightful and such historically based remarks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the speakers for our first panel, Attila Demko, Marek Matraszek, Hideshi Tokuchi, Michael Anton, Tony Abbott, and David Dusenbury. Gentlemen, if you'd like to take your seats.
Well, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you and the first panelist. We begin with Dr. Demko, who has a quarter hour to present his remarks.
Thank you very much. And I have to start with an apology. I will be very bleak this morning. Maybe it's the usual and legendary Hungarian pessimism. I will talk about the war and the possible outcomes of the war. Can I have my slides? So, I see no good outcomes in this war for any of the players, and I will try to briefly explain why, if I can figure out how it works. I don't know if I have some technical help, because this is not the usual type of right side. I tried that. Oh, okay. There are three. So, well, what Russia wanted at the beginning. So they wanted, of course, they saw the West as weak, and they tried to exploit this perceived weakness. And of course, they were wrong. Russia failed the first moment. If you look at its strategic goals, that's very clear. So from a strategic sense, Russia lost the war. Original goals are impossible to reach for Russia. So it's a strategic defeat. So what is the goal of Russia now? I think the goal is to preserve the regime at all cost. That's their goal now, to survive, which is not a very good position to be in. And of course, because of this, I think they would accept now a face-saving freeze of the war. And if it doesn't happen, and if their prized possession, of course, which was taken illegally with the first Russian aggression, because we always forget this is 2022 is not the first Russian aggression. Of course, 2014 and the illegal annexation of Crimea is the first Russian aggression. But if Crimea would be endangered, I am on those, with those who think that there will be a very, very rough Russian response. And what is the other issue, the economy for Russia? And I think, unfortunately, Russia is doing generally better than we thought. And they don't really care about the economic price. Since it's now regime survival and the survival of his historical mythology. Mr. Putin is a historian, or that's what he thinks about himself. So his idea about history is not giving up Crimea at any cost. So I'm pretty sure that he would go to any length to defend Crimea. So what I see now with Russia, that Russia is ready for a long war, and in not a very brilliant way, and in a not a very, let's say, sophisticated level, but it can fight a long war. So Ukraine, drivers of Ukraine, I mean, the driver of Ukraine is very clear and very simple from the beginning, to survive. And that's, again, it's very natural that Ukraine is doing everything to survive. And of course, for the US, the most important supporter of Ukraine, and I think we all know that without the United States of America, Ukraine would not stand by today. Of course, to keep at least the status quo. And also we have to see that the United States is making Russia to pay a steep price for its aggression. So the current main goal of Ukraine, I think it's not only about survival now, because of the Ukrainian successes in the first phase of the war, but at least the capture of the February 24th contact line. I think that would be maybe if not a peace treaty, but definitely maybe a freeze. But also, if they can do it, the recapture of all Ukrainian territories. So I think we have to take seriously what President Zelensky is saying, especially because his people will not allow him to agree on less, at least in this situation. So there is no room for lesser proposal. And the US and the West cannot, at least openly cannot push Ukraine to any freezing or any peace treaty without reaching these results. And I think I said that Russia can sustain the war effort. And of course, with the help, the current, or even I think there is a need for even greater help, Ukraine can sustain the war effort for years. I'm not quite sure that as long as Russia, and at the end, last slide, I will talk about manpower. Ukraine has greater manpower limitations. So what is the situation right now? The situation right now, there is no room for compromise between the two. There is no compromise. The main option to continue the war, to raise the stakes. So what would be an ideal solution? As I said, I will be very bleak, but still I speak a bit about an ideal scenario, and I don't see it's very likely. And of course, that would be a Ukrainian military victory, with first a Zaporizhzhia frontline breaks through, which would lead to Russian internal turmoil. And if there is a Russia, and I think that's the hope of Ukraine, if something happens in the Kremlin, and in that case there would be no escalation from Russia. And then the re-establishment of Ukraine's territorial integrity would happen. Russia would pay reparations, and there would be a path for Ukraine to NATO and EU membership. So that's an ideal situation. I'm a historian by training. I never seen an ideal end to any wars, but maybe it will happen now. But even that, and I, again, apologies to Andrei and my Ukrainian friends in the crowd, even that would leave Ukraine very weakened, in a weakened Europe, and the Russia in chaos on the long term. And the Russia in chaos, that's not something we could be very happy with, because we can all imagine, and we all remember the 1990s when Russian scientists, for example, helped the North Koreans to build their nukes. So it's not a good scenario, the Russia in chaos scenario. So the most likely scenario, at least in my view, and that's what I'm seeing basically since the start. And I think we had a talk with James Carafano, and again, more than a year ago, when the Ukrainians were very successful defeating the Russians in Kiev. And even then I said that it's very, very unlikely for a full Ukrainian regaining of territories. And even that, I think, a freeze could happen only if both Russia and Ukraine are completely exhausted. But of course, it's not a real solution. It's not a solution if we freeze the war, because it can restart in the future. There would be no reconstruction, no serious reconstruction. Who is investing money into a country which has a permanent bloody frontier? And Ukraine, if you know Ukrainian history, even the name of the country is frontier, and it was a bloody frontier for hundreds of years. And unfortunately, in a way, it's a repeat of history. What's happened, it would be a repeat of history. So what happened before many times could happen again. Again, for 8 years, from 2014 to 22, we had a bloody frontier. It was not peace in Ukraine. It's an illusion to think it was peace. Every year people died, maybe 30, maybe 40, but there was no reconstruction. I traveled through these areas. There was nothing, no development, and it's not possible. Because who will invest large amounts of money to a country which can have a restarting war at any time? And of course, Europe is also being weakened. Why? The energy issue. We cannot have the same price from any other country. German economy is suffering. We have the inflation, and it can continue for quite a while. So we are not in a good situation. And what would happen to Russia if there is a bloody freeze? Russia would be in need of allies. And who is the most likely ally? And of course, it's China. And Russia would be a junior player. Would be a very junior player. Of course, the Chinese are clever not to say it openly that, guys, you are 10 times smaller than us. You failed in Ukraine. Your army is a failure. They will not say this. But when we see Russia and China negotiate today and how the Chinese are negotiating on gas prices and everything, Russia is already a junior partner of China. But from a geopolitical perspective, are we happy with that? Russia and China together? I mean, this is the heartland power. What Mackinder said 100 years ago, we see it today happening. And I think that's the most likely scenario. So are we happy about this? To see China, Russia, Iran, and some other rogue states together? That's not a good result. And that's why I said I will be very bleak. That's what I see the most likely. And the worst case, and I have several worst cases, sorry for that, there can be a total infrastructure war from both sides. Now we think that Ukraine did the Nord Stream, but there are plenty others to blow up from Ukrainian side and also from Russian side. There is the Turk Stream, which is under the Black Sea, and we have seen some strange movements around the Turk Stream lately. We have the fantastic named Brotherhood pipeline. These Soviet names are so funny. Of course, there is no brotherhood anymore among Ukraine and Russia, except for the Moscow subway, when there is a big friendship painting. It's still there. I don't think that there is any more country more hated in Ukraine than Russia today, and I think I understand that fully. But critical infrastructure could be in danger everywhere. And, you know, last year we were lucky with the Russian infrastructure war. Why we were lucky? Maybe because of climate change or just the good weather. We had no winter. I don't know if you are from the US, your experience was different. We had no winter in Europe. Nothing. And most of Ukraine was lucky too. But is it like a certainty? Can we rely on luck all the time? So there can be a colder than usual winter. I hope not. What would happen? Further refugees from Ukraine. So what I see, it can be a Russian. I see in all scenarios a Russian strategic loss. So don't get me wrong. It's a strategic loss for Russia because they lost much more than they can possibly gain. But it can be sold as a partial victory. And if you look at the Russian TV, they are selling the smallest 100-meter offensive as a victory. Worst case too, and I'm rather afraid of this, Russian escalation due to military defeats or incidents with NATO aircraft or recon assets. And we have seen several such incidents. And the Russians were pretty crazy with the British plane, almost shooting it down with 30 British personnel in it. So I cannot vouch for Russian cool-headedness, since there is no such a thing. And of course, these were downplayed, but we are getting the data how it was. And since Russia has basically Russian conventional military is degraded to a very large degree. So what could Russia deploy against NATO? Unfortunately, it's WMD. I don't see it's a highly likely scenario. Actually, I see it a highly unlikely scenario. But the possibility is here. It's not some kind of, if somebody says that in Hungary you are a Russian propagandist, at least by the left and progressives. But this is a reality. It's more than zero. And we talk about World War III, more than zero is not a very comfortable situation. So let's have two quotes up. One is from the Finnish president. And just very recently he said that we are not in such a comfortable situation. And even small things can change matters a great deal. And we have to see the unforeseen consequences, the butterfly effect, things can happen. And Mark Milley said several similar things, warnings before. And I think this is an imperative to avoid an escalation. Because one thing, it would be the worst result for Ukraine if there is an escalation to NATO-Russian conflict, because Ukraine would be destroyed first. We would come second. And of course, Russia. But I'm not sure how sane some of the Russian leaders are today. So what, and again, excuse me for my because what's the best case means for Ukraine? And I think I'm from Hungary, we deal a lot with demography. There will be a severe demographic crisis. Ukraine was 37 million before the war, plus around 6 million on Russian-occupied land. But Ukraine will end up, after the war, if at least our counting with my fellow researchers, around 30 million at the best case. Right now, and these are Ukrainian sources, several Ukrainian sources telling me from Kiev that the dead is more than the American estimate. So it's around 120, 140,000 Ukrainian dead, 25 to 50,000 amputees, and then tens of thousands more who will never be in full health. And 20% of Ukraine is devastated with millions of shells and mines. Economic damage, no, it's very hard to assess, but it's well in excess of $1,000 billion US. And if you look at the Ukrainian GDP, how much it was, the Ukrainian GDP was before the war about the same like the Hungarian. So with 40 million was, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the best outcome come from Ukraine is not a good outcome. And let me show you the demographic numbers. This is Ukrainian demographic tree. That's the Hungarian. Hungarian is very unhealthy, but look at the Ukrainian. And the last year, there were 195,000 Ukrainian births. In Hungary, again, with less than 10 million people, 90,000. So you can imagine what Ukraine is facing. And if you look at the bulge there, those ladies who are in the best age to have children, they will just run out because, they will get older in the next few years because of one thing. Demography collapsed in Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union, 1991. That was 30 years ago. So all the greater generations were born before 1991. So if this war doesn't end soon, and ladies are in Western Europe and men are on the front line, these numbers, which are worse than the South Korean numbers, will continue to happen. So from a demographic point of view, Ukraine is in a very hard situation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Demko, for this very sobering assessment, which I think represents a Hungarian perspective on the conflict. And we now come to Mr. Matraszek, who will bring a Polish perspective on the conflict. Please, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers, especially John and all his friends in Heritage and Melissa for putting on, once again, this very, very important platform for a deeper discussion about the challenges which we face in the region. And you're right, David, there is a very strong Polish perspective. And what I'm about to say really reflects very much what is today the consensus view within the Polish government, understood as the current leadership of the Law and Justice Party, and President Andrzej Duda as well, and to a large extent the political opposition led by Donald Tusk. We're in the middle of an election campaign. As you know, we have elections on the 15th of October in Poland. But the perspective on Russia, which I'm about to sort of go over, is really pretty much the consensus view of the Polish political elites. I'm not saying it hasn't changed over time, and I'm not saying it won't change in the future, given all the exigencies and challenges of reaching a final peace in Ukraine will undoubtedly bring with it. But nonetheless, this is the view today. And I've only got limited time, so I'll try to pass through these 3 or 4 themes as rapidly as I can. And there's a perspective on Russia, there's a perspective on Ukraine, there's a perspective on NATO, and there's a perspective on regional cooperation as well. So on Russia. So the consensus view, and it was articulated actually as recently as last week in Krynica by President Andrzej Duda, who attended and gave a speech on this theme. So basic principle, Russia is an inherent aggressor. Russia has imperial ambitions which remain unsated. And these ambitions are common not only to the political leadership of Russia today, but also to the Russian people, who are, as it were, infected by an aggressive gene, which remains unshaken over many, many decades, if not centuries. And this essential aggressive imperialist ambition of Russia, colored by ideology, which is essentially fascistic in nature. In other words, combining national mythology, millenarian religious sentiments, and ultimately ethnically driven, is something which is very strongly embedded in the Russian national psyche. And there's no evidence that this mindset of both elites and the Russian population is going to change in the short or medium term. So these great Russian ambitions are an existential threat to peace in Europe. And Ukraine is just one example, it's just one stage in the implementation of this Russian national vision. It was preceded by civilian, essentially genocide in Grozny. We saw it in Crimea. And from the Polish perspective, Ukraine is just one small step in the expansionist attitude of Russian elites and Russian peoples. The ruling Law and Justice Party right now very frequently refers to the visionary speech of the late President Lech Kaczynski in Georgia, in Tbilisi in 2008, where at the moment of the Russian invasion, he famously, together with other leaders, went to Tbilisi to give a major speech where he said, if we do not stop Russian ambitions in Georgia, then the next phase of their ambitions will be the Ukraine. Then if we fail to stop them in the Ukraine, their aggression will be directed towards the Baltic states. And after the Baltic states, if we fail to stop that aggression there, my country, Poland, will be next. And this speech is now being repeatedly played as part of the television election campaign of Law and Justice leading up to the elections in 2 or 3 weeks' time, essentially saying, we were correct. We in Poland, not just in Poland, but other commentators, other peoples in Central Europe, we were correct in this analysis of Russia. And there were those who were correct in that analysis, and there were those who were mistaken in their analysis of Russia. And here the main thrust of the ire of the Polish elites is towards Germany, and we're seeing a lot of public criticism of the posture of successive German elites over the not just the post-1990 period, but in fact the post-war period, failing to understand this essential essence of Russia and Germany, and particularly under the Merkel period, funding Russia, either directly or indirectly, through technology, through energy policy, and through failing to understand that Russia is essentially immutable in its imperialist ambitions and cannot be, quote unquote, civilized through interaction, trade, dialogue, and so on. So that also is a source of the current rupture, one of the sources of the current rupture in relations between Warsaw and Berlin. So what is the Polish response to this view? It's very clear. And this again was articulated by him. So I'm just articulating the views of the Polish elites. And President Duda last week in Krynica said the war aim of Ukraine must be to liberate 100% of Ukrainians' constitutional territory. Any centimeter of Ukrainian territory remaining under Russian control after the end of the war will be a victory for Russia, because it will have shown that aggression pays in terms of territorial aggrandizement. And the defeat of Russia is defined not just as a military defeat or a physical expulsion of Russia from the occupied Ukrainian territories, but it also involves bringing to account, to the extent possible, the Russian leadership for war crimes, the implementation of a reparations regime against Russia, the return of the refugees, and well, rather not refugees, but kidnappees, people who have been forcibly removed, especially children, which in itself is a war crime, has to be enforced. Now, whether or not that can be enforced is a secondary question, but that is the ideal goal. And driven by this assessment of the nature of Russia, in the very, very long term, it is perceived that it is actually in the interest of Poland to see the commencement of some sort of disassembling of the Russian Federation over time in a controlled manner. Whether that's possible or not, we don't know. But ultimately, that would be the historical goal. In the short term, however, the goal has to be to isolate, in other words, to continue as far as possible the sanctions regime, especially economic sanctions to the extent possible, continue the policy of diversifying away from dependency on Russia for energy sources, which means domestically, in the case of Poland, accelerating energy diversification and rapid implementation of a nuclear power program. But above all, instituting a very determined policy of military deterrence. There is, during as recently as 10 years ago, Polish security and defense and military strategy, which was drawn up in various planning documents by the Polish armed forces, assumed that in the event of a Russian assault on Poland, Poland would permit, as it were, Russia to come into the hinterland of Poland, and there was a plan that the Wisla River would be a point where Russia would be held off, NATO reinforcements would be come in, and Russia would be pushed back. That military strategy has been binned by the current administration, the current Ministry of Defense and President, replaced by a new strategy, which is basically to enforce or institute a system of military deterrence to prevent any significant incursion of Russia into Polish territory in the event of conflict, driven by the experience of the war crimes that have been committed by Russia in Bucha and in other places in Ukraine, where the presence of a Russian occupation force is essentially brings with death, rape, murder, genocide, and that cannot be allowed to happen. And that is actually one of the sources of the incredibly accelerated procurement strategy which Poland has now embarked on. You will be aware that Poland leads the way in NATO in terms of defense spending in relation to GDP. This year and next year it will reach an astonishing level of over 4%. despite the fact that NATO only mandates a minimum of 2%, Poland is moving forward with 4% plus, and much of that additional defense spending going towards acquisitions. Poland is investing hugely in rapid acquisition of anti-armor defenses, precision fire, so the acquisition of the American HIMARS system, accelerating air and missile defense capabilities, moving out on perhaps in the future on further aircraft acquisitions, and looking to multiple sources for this defense acquisition program, not only to the United States or European industry, but also to South Korea. In other words, to create a tripwire, effectively a conventional, if you like it, a conventional nuclear deterrent, making it absolutely unfathomable or incomprehensible for Russia to actually attempt any military assault on Poland. So that's Russia. Now, obviously, the other pillar of the Polish position, it relates to Ukraine itself. I don't have time to go into the history of Polish-Ukrainian relations over the throughout the 20th century, but it's very important to understand the shift that has come about in the thinking of Polish elites in relation to Ukraine as a people and as a nation state. Relations between Poles and Ukrainians prior to World War II was not a happy one, particularly in the Eastern territories. During the war, there was ethnic cleansing undertaken by Ukrainians in relation to Poles in what was then Eastern Poland. And there was a post-war exploitation by the communist regime of latent anti-Ukrainian sentiments within the Polish people, especially during the period of forced population transfers in 1947. But I'll leave that aside. But what is the interesting aspect is that during the communist period, in the Polish émigré community, particularly in Paris, where there was a Polish publishing house called Kultura, which was a haven for exiled Polish intellectuals. Huge amount of work was being done on the goal of Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation, driven by the realization that an autonomous, independent, statified nation state of Ukraine post the Soviet period was an absolute necessary condition of Polish national independence against Russia. And this realization that in the grand scheme of the relationship of containment of Russia, Ukrainian statehood and nationhood should be fostered and supported, became a common view of Polish political elites, which was immediately implemented after the fall of the Soviet Union. Poland was the second country after Canada, I believe, to recognize Ukrainian independence in 1991. And Poland, over the last 2 decades, despite all the ups and downs of domestic Ukrainian politics, was strongly committed to enhancing and building up Ukrainian statehood. So this foundational, the view on Ukraine didn't just emerge with the Russian invasion. It's deeply rooted in the consensus among Polish political elites about the absolute necessity for an Ukrainian statehood, as well as very difficult conversations that have to take place between Ukraine and Poland on a cultural level over these past historical injustices on both sides related to ethnic crimes and so on. And Poland's obviously reaction during the invasion of Ukraine has been very, very strong, both on the humanitarian level, the acceptance of over 8 million people have crossed the Polish-Ukrainian border since the war started. Of those, 2 million have remained in Poland and are relatively well integrated into Polish society. Poland was in the forefront of, to the extent that it could, transferring surplus military materiel and weapons and armored personnel carriers, howitzers, directly to Ukraine. Poland is performing a crucial role as a hub for repair and refurbishment of Ukrainian military equipment in collaboration with the United States in southeastern Poland, near the town of Rzeszów, there's almost a mini industrial center has been established to support that effort. And of course, Poland has been working very hard, and we saw that during the Vilnius summit, to maintain the political support for Ukrainian membership. Now, post-war, of course, things will become a little more complicated. Obviously, there are certain things which will not change. Poland will continue to push for NATO membership for Ukraine. Poland was very disappointed by the results of the Vilnius summit, which did not lay out that roadmap clearly enough. Poland will participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine, and it will maintain its strategic relationship in terms of defense and energy diversification. Now, there will be areas of conflict. That's unavoidable. We're seeing that today as we speak over the conflict over Ukrainian grain imports into Poland. There are issues with refugees, and of course there are unresolved historical issues, as I've said. But I think the level of statesmanship on both sides will be enough to bring those issues together. The grain crisis that we're seeing now is largely driven by Polish domestic politics and the election. The Law and Justice Party is determined to maintain its vote within the agricultural rural community, and the decline in grain prices is a big electoral issue. This will pass away after the election. Now, I'm conscious I've run out of time, but perhaps that's a blessing, because it will give me something to comment on during the Q&A, perhaps. So thank you very much, Dave.
Wonderful. Well, we heard of NATO membership at the very end of Mr. Matraszek's remarks, and I think this is relevant to Professor Tokuchi's remarks coming to us from Tokyo. Yes.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank the Danube Institute and the Heritage Foundation for having me in this great event. I'm very much grateful to all those who made my trip to and stay in this beautiful city possible. Thank you very much. And actually, I prepared a 34-page slide material, but of course, I'm fully aware that I can't afford time to cover all of them, so I'll skip some of them. Well, today, Japan-NATO relationship is closer than ever. And in February, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg visited Tokyo, and in his speech over there, he said, as shown in this slide, of course, he's right, because there is no such thing as security for Europe alone or peace for Asia alone. Actually, it was echoed by Japan's Prime Minister Kishida, as quoted by Mr. Levy in his keynote speech. However, he is not necessarily right, because we are not oceans apart. We are connected by the sea, and that's why Japan and NATO have common interests in maritime security. And today, the connecting power of the sea space is more important than its shutting power. Asia, particularly East Asia, is a huge seascape, and the term Indo-Pacific represents the two great oceans. Maritime security is at the top of the list of long-standing security issues in the new ITPP between NATO and Japan, and most of the 5 goals in this priority issue of emerging security in the new document are closely related to maritime security. Maritime security cooperation is critically important for Japan, because Japan defined itself as a maritime country in its new national security strategy. The rule of law is at stake, particularly by the authoritarian countries' attempt to alter the status quo by force. And international norm against use of force is reaffirmed by the overwhelming majority of the international community after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But if not buttressed by might, it will easily end up with hollow exchange of words, building our respective countries' national power and generating synergy of such efforts is important. The Japanese are more security-minded today, as clearly expressed in the new national security strategy. Speed of Japan's efforts have become much faster due to the aggravation of the security environment. And what is behind such an ambitious initiative? Japan started the process of the revision of the strategy before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It started against the backdrop of intensified great power rivalry, as Japan is located at the forefront of the great power competition. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine became a wake-up call, big wake-up call for the Japanese. And that invasion tells us a number of points. I'm sorry, I skipped this. Traditional type of all-out warfare with guns and tanks and manned aircraft take place even in the 21st century. We have to be well prepared not only for cyber operations, but also for use of physical firepower. And at the same time, anything is easily weaponized. Information also works as a tool to manipulate the public opinion and to penetrate into the decision-making process of sovereign states. Comprehensive national power must be strengthened, and strong guts to fight back are also necessary. And otherwise, a long-lasting war of attrition couldn't be fought, and international support couldn't be won. Japan sits in a very unique geographic location surrounded by three nuclear and authoritarian powers, Russia, China, and North Korea. They do not share the democratic principle of the rules-based international order. They prefer a more hierarchical order. North Korea doesn't have any intentions to abandon nuclear capability. And Russian invasion of Ukraine set a very bad example for North Korea. North Korea is even closer to Russia now, just as we witnessed when Kim Jong-un, leader of North Korea, visited Russia very recently. It keeps launching ballistic missiles, and the ICBM launch, in recent years. Actually, it's a global threat, not a regional threat anymore. China's military buildup is very rapid, including its Coast Guard. China Coast Guard has military missions too. China Coast Guard ships intimidates Southeast Asians in the South China Sea, as shown in this picture, and also regularly intrude into the territorial waters around the Japanese Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Of particular concern for Japan is the possibility of Taiwan contingency. Japan is only 110 kilometers apart from Taiwan. G7 leaders, the G7 leaders reaffirmed the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as indispensable to security and prosperity in the international community at Hiroshima in May. So it's a global challenge too. Russia's continuous threat of use of nuclear weapons is possibly eroding the credibility of US extended deterrence. So Japan's efforts to strengthen the Japan-US alliance, as well as Japan's diplomatic efforts for non-proliferation, have become extremely important. Russia's conventional forces are suffering loss, and it will be more dependent on its nuclear force. Defense of the Sea of Okhotsk, where the Russian SLBMs are deployed, will be a focal point for Russia. To make matters worse, Russia and China are threatening Japan by jointly maneuvering in the vicinity of Japan. And all these issues made the revision of the Japanese national security strategy inevitable. Threat perception indicated in the new strategy is much, much different from its predecessor of 2013. Actually, I do not think there is any additional need to explain these slides. National security is not just about military affairs. The dividing line between peace and war has disappeared. As in the expression of Russian General Valery Gerasimov, wars are not declared, but simply begin. That's why Japan's new national security strategy enumerates diplomatic, defense, economic, technological, and intelligence capability as main elements of a comprehensive national power, and establishes the way to integrate these 5 capabilities. Economic security is emphasized in the document. Economy in our societies is based on commercial decisions, but the decision will have considerable impacts on our national security. We have to align with each other to make our economy and critical infrastructure less vulnerable, and to protect our critical technologies from the threats of authoritarians. Japan's national defense objectives are generic. It doesn't require any additional explanation, like independence of nation or such and such. The approaches to achieve the goals have 3 pillars as shown here: self-help, alliance with the United States, and broader partnerships with other like-minded countries. The dividing line between the second pillar and third pillar are becoming lower. A number of unilateral frameworks are developing fast. Some of them are upgraded almost to a semi-alliance level. Japan-Australia and Japan-UK partnerships are epitomizing it. Look at the very recent Japan-Australia Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation, JDSC, of October of last year, as shown here. And also the Hiroshima Accord between Japan and the UK signed on the sideline of the G7 Hiroshima Summit this May. And also the Japan-Korea-US, Japan-South Korea, of course, Japan-Korea-US partnership is rapidly catching up, as shown in the split of Camp David released jointly by the leaders of Japan, South Korea, and the United States last month. The Japan-US alliance is not simply bilateral. It's an integral part of the US alliance network in the Indo-Pacific region or Asia-Pacific region. And synergy of the US bilateral alliances and other security partnerships should be generated to strengthen the rules-based international order. Japan NATO and also Japan-EU partnerships should be enhanced in this context as well. The core concept of Japan's international security partnership is the vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. Prime Minister Kishida launched Japan's new plan for this vision in his speech in India in March. And this pillar has, this plan has 4 pillars. I'm very sorry for this, these tiny letters. Very sorry about that. But the core of the first pillar on the principles and rules is the rule of law. And the second pillar, Indo-Pacific way, probably means equal partnership. And third pillar of multi-layered connectivity focuses on Southeast Asia, South Asia, and also Pacific Island regions. And the most important pillar in this context is, of course, the fourth pillar on the right-hand side of this page. The new plan stays focused on maritime space, and include maritime security efforts, including, of course, joint military exercises, very different from the previous explanations by the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and former explanation by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Anyway, the Quad of Japan, US, Australia, and India is the leading partnership to advance this vision for free and open Indo-Pacific. The Quad is not an alliance, but is an important partnership to engage India with the US alliance network in that region. Both Japan and Australia are US allies already. And as I already explained, relationship between Japan and Australia is a quasi-alliance. So the only weak link is with India. These four countries are major responsible actors in the region, upholding the rules-based international order. As India, of course, we know that India remains a revisionist power. So that's why we have to capitalize on this opportunity to keep engaging India. The Ukraine war tells us that international partnership is indispensable. However, without robust military capabilities, security cooperation wouldn't be effective. It's a challenging job for Japan to maintain the current momentum by winning robust public support for its defense efforts. And Japan and Europe should align their views and policies, including their strategic priorities, resource allocations, and allocations to address common threats. The Japan NATO ITPP identifies 16 specific goals in 4 priority areas. It will work as the guideline for the enhancement of interoperability and their individual resilience. As Japan continues to invest in its national defense and to enhance its partnership with NATO and also with the EU, Japan will be a dependable partner for Europe for common security. So I stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tokuchi. And now a perspective from the United States from Mr. Michael Anton.
Thank you. I guess my role, once again, which I'm accustomed to at fora and venues like this, is to make everyone mad and leave the room hated universally. I don't enjoy making people mad, but I will accept that rather than say something that I don't believe. I also, I hope I don't overly anger the Hungarians. This is my 3rd trip here in 2 years, and I really like it here. So I don't want to make you so mad that I get PNG'd from the country, my passport taken if I try to re-enter or something in the future. So I'm going to get a little bit pedantic. I'll try to keep the pedantry to a minimum, but I just have to explain a couple things historically. So my topic is U.S. strategy must be fighting economic, not a military conflict, primarily with China. I think our problems with China are and have been for a couple of decades, 3 decades, maybe longer, much more economic than military. So the history lesson goes something like this. China won the Civil War, or the People's Republic, the communists won the Civil War in 1949. And from 1949 to 1972, the United States just didn't talk to China. In fact, it officially considered the government on Taiwan, the Republic of China, as a legitimate government of China, although it knew full well that that government did not control any territory on the mainland. In 1972, of course, President Nixon makes his famous trip to China, in which he adopts a policy of ambiguity that is sort of still in play today. I think I saw that on a couple of slides, that recent declarations at international fora this year, countries have reaffirmed the one China policy. Well, they do and they don't. The original Nixon policy, which was only in place for 7 years, was that the United States was officially agnostic about there is one China, but we didn't know which one it was. We just pretended like it's there. We'll figure out later what it is. And that was abandoned formally by the Carter administration in 1979 when it recognized the PRC as the legitimate government of China, pulled the, I think actually the Taiwan's seat on the United Nations Security Council was pulled before that, but it was officially granted to the PRC. Why the Carter administration did that, I think, has a lot more to do with internal Democratic versus Republican kind of jockeying that was more domestic than foreign. In other words, I'm not sure it was a super well-considered decision, but one of the things that had divided the Republican and Democratic parties in the immediate aftermath of World War II was the question of how to handle China. There were a lot of hurt feelings over this, and there was a lot of sentiment, especially on the Democratic left, that the PRC ought to be recognized and that these, frankly, at that time, still anti-democratic government in Taiwan was not worthy of American support. Keep in mind, this is the same administration that abandoned the Shah and Somoza. Wisely or not, I happen to think unwisely, and I refer you to one of the greatest foreign policy articles of all time on that subject by Jeane Kirkpatrick, Commentary Magazine, February 1979, called Dictatorships and Double Standards. In any event, the Reagan administration saw an opportunity there are and have been for many decades, if not centuries, serious cleavages or differences between China and Russia that the Reagan administration saw as an opportunity to further pry or tap the countries apart in a Cold War context. And the United States got very cozy with China in the 1980s for this reason. That also happened to be at a time when China was opening itself up economically. Essentially formally, if not, well, not formally, informally, but unmistakably abandoning communist economics for economic growth. Now, I think the fundamental reasons for that internally, from the Chinese perspective, were number one, after 10 years of cultural revolution and stagnation, many longer years of stagnation and privation, the Deng Xiaoping and the new leadership, Mao died, if I recall correctly, in 1976, believed they had to find a new basis for legitimacy if they were going to keep this regime in power. And one of those bases was going to be rising living standards. We promise you rising living standards and a more powerful country. And if we deliver on that, that means we're keeping our promise and you should keep us in power or not be so super restless. And the other point, which is this very simple one, is if you want to be a great power on the world stage, especially in a technological era, you need a lot of money. Right? Manpower alone isn't going to cut it. You want to build a sophisticated military, you need money, you need domestic industry, you need technology sectors and companies. And they understood this, the Chinese leadership, I think, in the late 70s. Now, coming back to the United States, a bet was placed at this point, I think initially in the late 70s, early 80s, and then renewed after Tiananmen Square in the late 80s, early 90s. And that was to say, the bet was, and this was a bipartisan bet, and supported by, not universally, but widely, and supported by a lot of intellectuals and foreign policy experts and so on. And I'm not so much criticizing this, I'm just trying to play the dispassionate analysis and tell you what happened. I don't know what I would have done had I not been, in grade school at the time this bet was placed, but had been in some position of authority. To quote the great philosopher Sam Spade, played by Humphrey Bogart in the 1941 movie The Maltese Falcon, it's not always easy to know what to do. Okay, so it seemed reasonable at the time to place this bet. That is to say, as China economically liberalizes, it will over time, perhaps it'll take a long time, but it will over time politically liberalize, and it will come to behave better on the world stage. And as late as 2005, just as I was leaving the first Bush administration, I happened to be in the audience in New York when the then Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zellick, a very accomplished man in almost every respect, we can go into his resume later if you want, gave a speech to an assembled audience of New York grandees. I was just there. I wasn't one of the grandees. In which he used the word stakeholder. I think I counted it 17 times. And his point was, as China rises, becomes richer and more powerful, it must become a responsible stakeholder in this international system. And that was part of the bet. Part of the bet was China will behave like Western powers have behaved. It will behave like the United States or like a Western European nation or like one of the East Asian democracies, and it will take its place in this community of nations, and it won't seek to protect its perceived interests in ways that threaten or undermine or challenge that system. So the bet was placed, and I think we can all agree, well, you don't have to agree, I will assert my view that we lost that bet. It turns out that it didn't work. What was promised didn't pan out, and I think that's one of the reasons why you get the Trump's surprising primary victories in 2016. Those were kind of overdetermined. There were a lot of reasons for them. But one of them is he was the first to really call out and challenge this bipartisan consensus on China in the American political context. And really the primary voters who responded to Trump on this issue strongly in 2015 and 16 were much less worried about what China was doing internationally than what had been done to the United States economy by China's trade practices. Now, I was also in the audience when in Beijing in November of 2017 as a White House aide, when the president said, he gave a kind of dressing down in a way, sounded like tough talk about what the Chinese government had done to the United States economy. But then he said, I think amusingly and truthfully, he said, but I don't blame you. When President Xi Jinping was sitting right there, he almost said it to him. I don't blame you. I blame us. We let this happen, right? And I think he was right about that. We let it happen both politically, and we let it happen because there were a lot of business interests who wanted it to happen. This consensus wasn't built without bumps and without controversy. If all of you can remember as far back as the 1990s, President Clinton got himself into a lot of trouble over the China question several times and seemed to not be quite sure which way he wanted to go on policy. And each time a kind of crossroads hit, the business community, Fortune 500 CEOs, Wall Street CEOs, economics PhDs, all the think tank leadership who specialized in trade and things would come to him as essentially a united front and say, you really have no choice but to continue this policy of openness and integration with the Chinese economy. But the good news is not only do you have no choice, it's all going to work out well. So it's win-win. You're forced to do it, but it's the right thing to do, and it's going to have a very happy ending for everyone. Now, I think we know, again, my view is the bet didn't pan out. It did not have a happy ending for everyone. The deindustrialization of the United States economy accelerated very rapidly after China's accession to the WTO, which is something the Clinton administration spent years preparing but couldn't get over the line before they were termed out of office, and it's something the new Bush administration, which to be clear, I worked for, completed almost in the same way that Clinton had to finish the job of NAFTA that George H.W. Bush could not finish because he lost the 1992 election and was not reelected. So the bet having failed, one of the things that I very greatly credit President Trump for is realigning American public opinion, and even finally, if not realigning, at least, this sounds like a bad thing to say, but redividing elite opinion. In other words, an elite consensus that had held for 30 years that there's only one way to deal with China. Suddenly, other voices, more skeptical voices, could be heard again, and you started to hear, even Democrats. I mean, remember the Democrats in the United States for a long time were the Union Party. They were the party of the working man and of the industrial base. And they became, in the Clinton era, much more of a Wall Street elite university party. You started to hear even Democrats talk about the damage China had done to the U.S. economy. Now, they didn't want to give Donald Trump any credit for that, and they still don't, so it's difficult. What worries me, what has alarmed me, is that now that the United States has finally been able to admit that the bet didn't work and that China actually does pose serious challenges to the United States, I think our leadership is overly focused on the military and security issue at the expense of the economic issue, which is still a far greater challenge. And I mean economics broadly, not just, but that would include industrial espionage, IP theft. Now, some of that IP theft isn't even theft. It's a self-inflicted wound. You want to do business in China, you have to enter into a joint venture with either the Chinese government or a state-owned company, which amounts to the same thing, and you have to turn over all kinds of information about proprietary technology, which the Chinese just build on their own at a lower cost, and undercut the business who gave it away in the first place. That's not forced, though. This is something that our companies have done voluntarily. Now, they do it voluntarily because there's no option. If you want to do business, you have to do it. They could, however, say no and walk away, and for 30 years they didn't. So again, getting back to what the president said in Beijing, I don't blame them so much. I blame us. We made a lot of bad choices in regard to this. And it's a deep and difficult hole to dig out of. Admitting you have a problem is the first step to solving the problem. I think we've at least partially admitted it. But now my concern is we're focused on a security crisis, or at least a potential security crisis, when we have at our front doorstep in the United States with China, and have had for about half of my lifetime at least, an economic crisis. So now I'm going to say the really unpopular thing. It's nothing I haven't said before. I got booed for it before. I was called an appeaser, but I will repeat the point anyway, because why not? You guys, you need a little entertainment this morning, I think. Why the United States is now... Okay, back up a second. I'm from a think tank that's very skeptical of capital P progressivism. I won't go into the details on that. Just take my word for it. So you all love probably Teddy Roosevelt because he's such a colorful figure, right? Well, we have our philosophic problems with Teddy Roosevelt as a kind of Republican version of Wilsonian progressivism. On the other hand, there's a lot to love about Teddy Roosevelt. And one of the things to love about him is his very famous saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." What I worry the United States and some of our allies are doing now is the reverse. We speak loudly and we carry a small stick. We carry a broken stick. Now I'm going to be excoriated for criticizing my country on foreign soil, but again, as I say, I'm just a dispassionate analyst, or trying to be. So regarding Taiwan, okay, getting back to that history lesson. In 1979, Congress, upset about what the Carter administration did, I think rightly, passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which requires the United States to aid via military technology sales the defense of Taiwan. It is sometimes misinterpreted as a treaty or as something like the Article 5 guarantee in the NATO Charter, which it isn't, right? Now, I'm completely open to the argument that the United States has a moral obligation to defend Taiwan, and that the loss of Taiwan to China would be a disaster for American security in the East Asian Pacific security. However, one has to ask oneself what American capabilities really are right now to defend Taiwan. What I see as an amateur analyst is a consistent shifting of the balance of power in a Chinese direction that the United States hasn't matched or been able to match. When I made this point the first time at National Conservatism Conference in Miami in 2001, I was sitting with a China expert named David Goldman, and I brought up the point about how would the United States prevent, if the Chinese, which they've been patient about the Taiwan issue since 1949, right? I know it's the most important thing in the Chinese geopolitical outlook because they say so all the time. And yet, it being the most important thing, they've been patient about it since 1949. So, I don't know. Maybe they'll move tomorrow. I doubt it, but maybe they will. If they did, what could the United States effectively do? And that's a big question mark. And I mentioned, not casually, not offhandedly, gravely, the possibility of serious losses that the United States might suffer in the event that in its present dispensation and level of, suboptimal competence, let me put it that way, decided to move to prevent such an action. And David Goldman helped me out by just saying bluntly, yeah, Andy Marshall told me in 2013 that the Chinese can sink an American aircraft carrier and we don't have a defense for it. Now, Andy Marshall was the head of a think tank within the Pentagon for almost 50 years who died a couple of years ago, I think almost age 100. I think he was 97 or 98. If anybody knows what Chinese military capabilities versus the US Navy are, it probably would have been him. So I don't think we've sufficiently thought about that possibility, about what it would mean for our military, for our country, for our domestic politics, for our alliance structure, for the security architecture throughout the world that everyone here is praising and wants to see preserved, what it would mean if the United States recklessly talked itself, and not by itself, obviously it takes two to tango. I'm not saying that this is something that would be entirely resting on our shoulders, but I don't think that we have thought through fully what it would mean if such a conflict were to arise and the United States proved itself to have more trouble than a lot of people assume, meeting what a lot of people assume are its obligations. And the essence of statesmanship is to foresee such things and make the right call, not make another bet that turns out to be wrong, and not gradually over 30 years but quickly, suddenly, and with potentially catastrophic consequences. So every once in a while, some annoying person like me is going to raise these points. Thankfully, not very often. Most people just don't. But I would think it behooves all of us to think about them as we try to plan for and decide how we're going to jointly navigate a rather troublesome world. Thank you.
Thanks so very much, and we're always delighted to welcome back to Budapest the Honourable Tony Abbott, who will bring a perspective from Australia.
Well, David, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I've loved the kind of bleak realism from Hungary, the clear-eyed appreciation of Russia from Poland. I've loved the way that Japan is now well and truly part of the global security structure, particularly in East Asia. And I've also appreciated the dilemma which has just been presented to us on behalf of the United States. I think we have to be clear-eyed about this. The world is in the opening stages of a new Cold War. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The first Cold War was won because the democracies stuck together, and our great adversary then, the Soviet Union, appreciated that the United States would take massive risks on behalf of other free countries. This is a more difficult Cold War because China is a much more serious economic adversary than the old Soviet Union ever was, and it's now developing the military power to match its economic strength, and it is determined, first of all, to be the hegemon of East Asia and ultimately to be the world's top power. If the United States is not prepared to take similar risks on behalf of others in this new Cold War, I think we are in all sorts of trouble. I think that's the simple truth. That is the simple truth. Anyway, that's by way of opening summary. I do have a little presentation. Put yourself in the shoes of Vladimir Putin in mid-February last year. He's thinking, Ukraine is a rebel province that should once more be part of Greater Russia. The Ukrainians are divided, and Zelensky is a flake. The West is weak. Biden is addled, and my army can be in Kyiv in a week. Is it any wonder that he invaded? Because unlike Western democratic politicians who need to get elected and re-elected, dictators can focus on what they see as national glory, ahead of trying to build a better life for their mostly taken for granted subjects. So the big error of democratic policymaking is the assumption that dictators inhabit the same mental universe as democrats, and its corollary, the wishful thinking that dictators place a high value on human life and wouldn't see tens of thousands of deaths, maybe even more, as a fair trade for national aggrandisement. So far, although Putin's Ukraine adventure has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, probably more Russian than Ukrainian, all that would worry him is that he hasn't yet won, and that his failure to triumph has put his own survival at stake, as shown by the brief Wagner rebellion. Quite apart from the cost in smashed cities, human misery and lives cut short, in the wider world, the Ukraine war has meant food shortages in Africa and the Middle East, added to the cost of living crisis in Europe and elsewhere, and brought closer than in many decades the spectre of a World War III. But, terrible though all that has been, a war over Taiwan would be worse by several orders of magnitude, due to both antagonists' pivotal role in the globalised economy and America's defence guarantees to Taiwan. If America helped to defend Taiwan, there would be war between two nuclear-armed superpowers. Casualties would be massive, global escalation ever present, and the wider world deranged, as nearly all countries took sides. If America failed to defend Taiwan, the global system would collapse, as US allies realised that America would not run serious risks for others. China would become the hegemon of East Asia, with some countries making the best accommodation they could with the new force, and others arming themselves to the teeth to avoid subservience. Even a warlike build-up would disrupt most air traffic and maritime trade in East Asia and jeopardise all the supply chains dependent upon Taiwanese chips, Chinese intermediate goods, and Singaporean refined oil. In most developed economies, there would be shortages and economic hardship even before a shot were fired. Yet put yourself in Xi Jinping's shoes. He's thinking, my life's mission is ending the century of humiliation by taking back Hong Kong and Taiwan. Yet China's population, and maybe its wealth too, has peaked. The American people are divided and its leadership befuddled. My own people are restive as the economy slows and expectations are dashed. What better way and what better time to reinforce the CCP's legitimacy and secure my legacy than a national crusade to reunite the motherland before it's too late? As Ukraine shows, war's horror to us doesn't make it unthinkable to others. Its madness to us doesn't make it irrational to others with different priorities. With the Chinese government repeatedly declaring its firm intention to take Taiwan by force if necessary, and announcing its intention to be the world's top power by mid-century, an assault across the straits is more a question of when than if. And while military planners judge that China wants a few more years to improve its amphibious and anti-submarine warfare capability, the biggest factors in Beijing's decision-making will be, can it succeed, and is it needed for regime survival? Both could soon be in play, which is why raising the stakes for Beijing of any adventurism across the Taiwan Strait should be a global priority. Is the chance of an assault on Taiwan in the next couple of years 50% or 10%? No one can judge, but it's high enough for serious countries to have thought through their response. Australians, I have to say, are psychologically unprepared and militarily unready. For our part, in the fight we would have to join if the US did, should we want our alliance to survive. Given the high risk of conflict, democracy's natural tendency to assume business as usual, an understandable reluctance to prepare for something they abhor, is now akin to sleepwalking through Lotus Land. For Australia, deterrence should mean seeking to base Australian ships and planes in Japan in a sign of solidarity with our fellow island democracy and its threatened neighbour, so that Beijing must fear that any conflict could be China versus the world, rather than the pitifully unequal struggle of 1.4 billion Chinese against 25 million Taiwanese. A very high priority should be reassuring all those Australians of Chinese background that our apprehensions about Beijing do not extend to them. Deterrence means helping Taiwan to harden its military bases, to strengthen its missile shield, to build its capacity to destroy an invasion fleet, and to wreak havoc on Chinese military bases. And it should mean removing Chinese intermediate goods from the democracy's key supply chains to minimise vulnerability to economic pressure. None of this implies any weakening whatsoever of our commitment to Ukraine, because the best discouragement for one dictator is the defeat of another.
Wonderful. Well, this concludes our prepared remarks, and I would like to begin by asking our panelists. I think we can then open the conversation up amongst ourselves. I'm sure all of your remarks have led to questions in your minds, but I would like to begin by looking back to something our first speaker said. You said, Dr. Demko, that Russia seems to have settled in for a long war, and unless I'm mistaken, I believe this is rhetoric which has actually been echoed very recently by Jens Stoltenberg and NATO, that we're increasingly the kind of slow and extremely exacting nature of the Ukrainian counteroffensive seems to have led to a realization on all sides that this is an enduring conflict. And of course, many analysts, like we just heard from Tony Abbott, many analysts believe that this long war is actually the opening salvo in a much longer war, which you called a new Cold War. I suppose I would like to ask all of our panelists from their different regions and countries and perspectives how the time factor will affect their people, their region, and in a sense, who the prolongation of the conflict stands to benefit and hurt the most.
Is that a hint?
Look, these are very difficult times. They are very, very difficult times. I mean, I suspect that in 10 or 15 years, we will look back on 2020 before the pandemic as the best time in human history, because in the previous few decades, the world had never been more safe, more free, more rich, or more fair. And all of that, of course, was guaranteed by the Anglo-American power structure and the global world order that it sustained. Now, of course, America has lost the will to sustain it. I think that's the honest truth. America has lost the will to sustain it. And there isn't really anyone else capable of stepping in. I think that it's very important that America's friends and allies, Japan, Australia, particularly the United Kingdom, do what they can to support America. But in the end, it's an American decision. How many risks are we prepared to take? What price are we prepared to pay to help the whole world, including us, to be free and to be fair? But inevitably, the benefits will be disproportionately for other countries than for the United States. And this is what Obama, in a polite way, recognised, and what Trump, in a really impolite and at times nasty way, recognised. And this is what we're all struggling to come to terms with now.
Well, I mean, David, you touched on the crucial point, which at time. I mean, you're absolutely right. This is the fundamental Achilles heel of the West, is that the West is much less prepared than Russia to go for the long haul. I think the West actually was surprised itself initially about how, rather surprisingly, it did come together. That first 48, 72 hours of the invasion was a real wobble period. And had it not been for the determination of Zelensky and the sort of the happy coincidence of the intelligence breach which allowed the Ukrainians to prepare for the attempt to seize Hostomel airport, we would be in a very different place. I think the West, particularly the US administration, was not ready for this being a long haul. They wanted to evacuate Zelensky from Kiev. There was no sense that Ukraine would get its act together. Or that there would be this almost, albeit slow but steady coming together of those forces in Europe, especially within Central Europe, who drew the United States and drew many other NATO allies into the realization that this war had to be fought. We had to stand firmly on the side of the Ukraine, and we had to have the goal of defeating Russia. And the other point that I think is crucial is, but still we're not quite at the point where I think that there is a consensus that Russia has to be defeated. I mentioned what the polls had defined as defeat, but there is still this latent obsession with preserving Russia as a nation state and preserving its integrity and making sure that it's some sort of actor that we can work with because of China, etc. There is no acceptance within Western elites that Russia actually should be defeated. And that is one of the reasons why I think we are not getting the degree of military engagement that we could be getting, particularly in the decisions, long-awaited decision to supply more precision fires, capability, the famous ATACMS missiles, all of the things that were the Ukrainians to actually possess them, they would actually potentially be able to break through the Zaporozhye, to retake Crimea, to completely degrade the capability of Russia to maintain this war. So, and because of that failure to adequately and speedily arm Ukraine, you are getting into the position where this war, yes, it is dragging out. And that is to the advantage of Russia, because as the war drags out, slowly the capability of Western democratic liberal societies to maintain support for the war starts to erode. I mean, that's the flip side of liberal democracy. You're seeing this counter-reaction in elections. You're seeing what's going on in Slovakia. You're seeing a little bit of that support starting to erode, even in Poland. And over time, as we've been seeing, Russia does just have not just the capacity to drag this out, it doesn't have the democratic structures in place that would allow any sort of protests to develop. And basically, the Russian leadership has this utter and complete barbaric disregard for human life, not just of the Ukrainian people, but of its own people. And it's not even the Russians, but it's people from the Far East are being sent into this campaign. This willingness and ability to absorb losses, human losses, and have this complete moral abnegation of that as being a bad thing is something that is a huge asset that Russia has. Not to mention all the other instruments it continues to deploy in Western societies through cyber, through espionage, through media manipulation, through social media messaging that then migrates into the popular mind, both in the United States and Western Europe. So all of these things, the more this war drags out, the greater advantage Russia has. And that is the key problem that we are facing. And as I said earlier, it's driven by this inability or unwillingness to actually go all out to try and inflict a final defeat of Russia.
Well, I completely agree with the Prime Minister. We are facing, a new Cold War, or even more. I think it's the crisis of the 21st century that we are facing. And what we have seen before 2020, these were the beautiful times with blue skies, and all the crises, what we thought were crises, will be minuscule compared to what is coming. And the crisis of the 20th century was not the Cold War. The crisis of the 20th century was the two world wars. So I'm comparing what is coming to this, to the first half of the 20th century. But I think that there are two things we didn't speak about till now. That it's not only Russia and not only China, which is a big problem. The ship of the world doesn't have just two holes on it. There are several others. We have Africa, just south of Europe, which is blowing up. Not only the Sahel region, but in a wider sense, Africa is blowing up. What will happen to Pakistan? That country is in a very, very difficult situation. Climate change, economic problems. And I could continue with several dozen countries which are in dire straits, several dozen large countries. I don't know if you have seen the news a few days ago. The biggest nation of Africa, the strongest power of Africa, Nigeria, had a blackout for a day. And I checked out how much electricity Nigeria is producing with more than 200 million people. Nigeria is producing less electricity than Hungary, with less than 10 million people. So we can imagine the challenges these countries are facing. So we have a systemic crisis. Russia could invade Ukraine because of a systemic crisis, not only because Putin is a mad person. No, he saw this systemic crisis, what is around us. And we are totally unprepared militarily, but also in our mind. Ukraine is defending itself like no other European country, maybe with the exception of Poland, could do from a mindset point of view. Can you imagine Germany with a very strong economy, German people going to fight in the trenches like Ukrainians do today? Germans were listening for 70 years that anything related to military is terrible. So, we see the Greens who were the most, let's say, against the military, and now they are, of course, very hawkish with Russia. But how you change the mindset? I have seen a chart on Europe who is willing to fight for their own country. It's terrible. Central Europe is okay. I tell you one example. In Hungary, those who are most willing to fight for the country, usually those are the most pro-Russian, but they are the most willing to fight even the Russians because these are the hardcore nationalists. But there is this approach, that nation, religion, it's not important. Then the country is not important. And if you look at the Western European data, it's 20% is ready to fight. 20%. Who would be in the trenches if Western Europe is being attacked? In Poland, it's more than 50. There are exceptions. It's Sweden, Finland, Norway. The Nordic countries are pretty amazing, especially Finland, a great addition to the alliance. But the Western European countries are just frighteningly low in terms of even to defend their own country, let alone defend an ally. So we are in a pretty bad situation. And what is I'm really surprised and afraid that seemingly the Russians are morally not that bad. When I thought that there will be, I thought there is one chance for the Ukrainians, two chances for the Ukrainians to defeat Russia. One is an internal Russian civil war, which didn't happen with the Prigozhin coup, and the other is a moral breakdown of the Russian army, and none of it happened. So now I think we are really in a long war, and in a long war in which I don't think we have the advantages in many ways. We have a technological advantage, that's it. Otherwise, we have a Russia, very nationalistic, ready to fight. Anyway, Russia was very high on the charts, who is willing to fight their own country. Morocco was the best, with almost 100% readiness to fight. So really have to see that we are morally, with the backbone, with the spine. The West has a very big problem. And until Ukraine has to fight, we are very brave. But when it's not Ukraine, but their own citizens, I think this bravery would disappear very fast. I'm not talking about the Baltics. Again, Poland, the Scandinavians, and even Hungary was quite high, actually around 50%. But again, Western Europe is in dire straits.
Well, the war between Ukraine and Russia has affected the entire world. It involves almost all the countries in the world. So it is not a local warfare just between Ukraine and Russia. It's a global warfare. And at the same time, this war is not just about military affairs, but it's about diplomacy, politics, and economy. So it's a kind of total warfare. And also its impact on East Asia is great, and so and also Russia denies the statehood of Ukraine. Therefore, it will continue for a long time, and the like-minded countries like the United States, Western Europeans, and Australia and Japan, they will continue to support for a while in order to defend Ukraine, but that it is not cost-free. How long can the ordinary public endure high gas price or higher food cost, or how long can they accept higher defense budget at the expense of other needs? So of course I'm not necessarily pessimistic about that, but we can't really be optimistic about those things. So therefore the political leadership is very much important, and political leaders must convince their constituents about which side is to blame and what is the cause of the war.
What was the last thing you said? Was who suffers the most? Obviously, the people who live there suffer the most, right? I mean, the United States is suffering from a lot of things. It's not suffering from that war. And I think that's safely to be said about many other countries. You know, to be the most unpopular person again, it seems to me it would kind of be better off for everybody if we could find a way to end it now, even if that meant the only way to end it now is to contemplate certain, there's no other word I can think of, concessions that would be really anathema to, I think, the political class in pretty much every country I can think of off the top of my head, who have made statements that are hard to, you know, turn around from or trim or hedge in any way. And rhetorically, therefore, everybody's dug into their various positions, not just the Ukrainians, not just the Russians, but the Americans and the Europeans and everybody. And with everybody dug into such a position and not willing to contemplate altering it. And in fact, the easiest way to get, there's one easier way to get denounced in the United States right now, but I won't go into that. The second easiest way to get denounced in the United States right now is to mention some of the things that one would have to be willing to countenance to play a useful role in diplomatically ending the war. And to use an American term, you will be swiftly canceled for that in the present dialogue, which just means this probably, unfortunately, I'm not sure it has to go on, but it is going to go on, and that's some of the reason that it's going to go on. And I don't know that that necessarily reflects well on the present leadership across a range of countries. Let me put it as diplomatically as I can.
Well, look, I hate to have a second bite of the cherry. I think the most important point that's been made so far is about the quality of political leadership. Why was the Second World War prosecuted to victory? Ultimately because it was Winston Churchill and not Lord Halifax leading the British government. Why is the Ukraine war happening? Because President Zelensky didn't take President Biden's, I think, pusillanimous offer of a helicopter ride to freedom. Now, yes, this is a horrible war. All wars are horrible, but sometimes the alternative is worse. And the reason why, of everyone, the people who are most determined to fight is the Ukrainians, is because they know just how horrible Russian overlordship would be, and good on them.
Well, I can only second the Prime Minister because, yes, I agree with you completely. There is a right and there is a wrong in this war, and there is a reason why there is a war. The reason why there is a war is because Putin invaded Ukraine. This war could stop tomorrow if Putin retreats. And that is the only thing that is keeping the war going, is the aggression of Russia. Any talk of, compromise or ceasefire or land for peace is ridiculous, because all it does is it fuels the prospect of an even further, greater conflict down the line. It legitimizes war crimes. It legitimizes the use of force in international relations. And it gives Russia a breathing space to rearm, reindustrialize its industrial base, and prepare for a further push. It gives Russia a new opportunity to disassemble Ukraine internally, to vassalize it, to install another regime in Kiev. And ultimately, it guarantees war in Europe in the longer run, in the Baltics and in Poland, because there is one lesson. If you invade Russia, you will be rewarded. And that is the one thing that cannot be allowed to happen in this conflict.
Well, I don't know if it redounds to my credit as moderator, but we're actually going to finish on time. And welcome the second panel, please. Thank our distinguished guests.